Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to give folks just a couple minutes to log into the event. And thank you again, everyone. We're just going to take another minute before we get started so folks can log on to the discussion. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us through those on our Zoom feed on YouTube. Really appreciate you taking the time to explore a bit more about the world of surveillance and the dystopian realities that we're seeing here at S.T.O.P, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. This is our weekly RadTech event where we discuss some of the cutting edge issues that we're seeing with policing, with surveillance technology, and with the ways it impacts democracy. And this month, we're joined by a friend, a colleague, one of our community advisory board members, Angel Diaz, who is counsel at the Brennan Center. He's in the Liberty and National Security Program, where his work focuses on the intersection of technology and civil rights and civil liberties. He's very active on issues related to policing and technology, as well as matters related to online speech and content moderation, which is clearly very timely for us and for the country as a whole at the moment. So, Angel, really glad you could join us to talk about this sort of work that you've been doing with smart devices and the ways that this information is being collected by law enforcement. But to start, could you tell us just in simple terms, what is a smart device? What are the tools that you're thinking of when you use that term?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's exciting to join you again. You know, smart devices are just generally any device that gets connected to the internet in one way or another. It can be your doorbell, it can be your fitness tracker, it can be a lot of cars have a bunch of technology embedded in them, although most cars, even if they don't have that technology, you hook up your phone and it does more or less the same thing. And all of these different devices are basically gathering information and storing it somewhere on a server. And so if you collect that data, there might come a day when law enforcement wants to access it to see if it can help them flesh out a story about something that happened involving you or somebody around you or someone that you may have known.
And when we're talking about law enforcement, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about a broad array of agencies. We're talking about, local police departments. We're talking about, national security agencies. We're talking about ICE. And really, it's, the full spectrum of government agencies, even, child welfare agencies that are using these devices increasingly to keep tabs on the public without any real checks. And I want to get a bit more detail on like what types of information these devices are capturing day to day. What are the things that you think are most surprising that these things now have a record of?
Yeah, I think that I don't necessarily think that people will be that surprised about the data that's being collected, although we'll talk about it. I think what might be more surprising is just sort of the reasons why they might want it may not necessarily be, as clear. To give you an example, there was a belief that a man had murdered somebody and then had used a bunch of water to wash off the crime scene. And so they went to look at the smart water meter to understand whether there was like unusual water usage during the time. Similarly, people kind of have an understanding that your fitness tracker will keep a sense of where you're moving and might monitor your heart rate. But if you tell somebody that you were asleep, but it shows that you were moving around your house or in a different place during the sort of testimony that you gave to police officers, that might be sort of contradictory information. So those are the kinds of things that might be a little surprising, but overall, I think that the technology doesn't just capture information about you. It could also capture information about, let's say you have a doorbell camera. That camera will capture information about any guests that come by your home or just happen to walk by. It'll capture information about service workers like post office workers or Amazon workers. If you have a domestic worker that comes into your house, that's also being tracked. And then sometimes folks have their cameras that cover sort of activity areas, so it'll capture what goes on in public streets. Something that may be not totally intuitive to people is that some of these technologies also have things like facial recognition set up into them. So Google's version of a Ring doorbell called the Hello doorbell has facial recognition and can also sort of basically keep an inventory of what they call familiar faces. So you can set up an alert. So every time that Albert comes by my door, I can get an alert on my phone saying, Albert, watch by your door.
Please do
Albert,
not do this. Please do. If you do it, I will find a way to sue you.
Yeah, and so I mean, one of the things about this is just that it's pretty invasive and also in pretty invisible ways. You would never know that I had that alert set up, and you would have no way of knowing. And you can sort of imagine this being abused to keep track of a crush that you're interested in or something like that. We've seen situations where basically what happens is when I get that alert, I can kind of open up my phone and then get a sort of live stream of what's going on at my doorbell. And the similar kind of technology can be put in cameras all over the place. So you can put a similar camera indoors to keep tabs on your pet or something like that. But what one woman experienced was her husband had been arrested, and I guess as part of that, they took an inventory of his phone, and she was at home breastfeeding her child and noticed that the camera for her indoor sort of smart connected device turned on, suggesting that perhaps somebody in the law enforcement office had accessed the person's phone and was using it to sort of spy on the person breastfeeding their kid.
So there's so much to unpack there because, like, well, first of all, just imagine the horror story where you're someone who decides to do a bunch of laundry at 2 a.m. You've got insomnia, you don't have anything better to do, you haven't gotten around to it, and suddenly because you have a spike in your water usage, that now is something that's being used to put you on trial for murder. Because the way a lot of these systems are being used, police are going in with assumptions that change in pattern X means you've committed crime Y. And a lot of that time, it's really just guesswork and pseudoscience. And I'm just terrified that just as we've seen wrongful conviction crises in America with, analog forensic science for years, and I'm hesitant to even call it science, you're going to see a lot of that same pattern repeating itself with these more invasive digital forensic science techniques. But
yeah, I think that's right, and we have seen sort of some examples like that. I think one of the more recent examples is an individual who would use sort of an application to track his bike ride around his neighborhood, and he happened to bike by a murder scene, and so he became, or it might have been a robbery, I'm sorry, and he became a suspect. And luckily that individual had the money to hire a lawyer and kind of go through the whole process. But to your broader point, when these technologies are used to sort of capture people that are the usual suspects of targets of law enforcement, they don't always have the same resources to fight these things, and can lead, even if it is that they are found that it was a wrong guess or something that was faulty, they can still lose days, weeks of their freedom while that all gets resolved. And that is something that is not only an issue of mistaken guesswork. A lot of the technologies that are being used, like facial recognition or emotion detection, or even just voice recognition and sort of translating what people are saying into text, all of those technologies have some sort of bias across racial lines. And so it's the reality that these technologies can't accurately understand and translate how people of color speak, but they're still being used to sort of do enforcement actions against them.
Yeah, and I think another part of it that came up when you were talking about the example of your camera being trained to, watch me, which I still find very offensive. With these dynamics, you're seeing the sort of consolidation of power that surveillance has enabled for, government actors for years, and to a lesser extent for corporate actors, now being put in the hands of every neighborhood homeowner. And like you're saying, it can be used for all these invasive tracking techniques. And I'm thinking of the work that Evaside has done at EFF on stalkerware, and it seems like there's so much potential for this to be used for facilitating intimate partner violence, using it to exercise authority over domestic employees. And there's so many ways that this is taking the power imbalances of our private lives and putting it on steroids.
Yeah, I mean, to build on that, there are documented instances of partners sort of turning on the lights, off the lights, putting on speakers, finding ways to basically like harass and domineer over their partners from work. They'll just be typing away and then decide, I'm going to harass my partner for 20 minutes. So these are not just sort of hypothetical things. We've already seen them happen. And to your point, these technologies, while they have maybe more connectivity now than they used to, we've already seen how these tools have been used in more analog settings to sort of keep tabs on people and intimidate folks. We've seen, nanny cams have been around for a long time. My entire work in this space spawned from like my mom asking me to like write a letter in English to her boss, asking her to like stop hiding cameras around the house she was cleaning.
I can't imagine how infuriating that must be, just as someone who works on these privacy issues, and to see these technologies weaponized against your own family. I mean, I know this isn't something we had discussed covering, but would you be comfortable sharing a bit more about just what the psychological toll is of of constantly being watched like that? Because I imagine all of this has to weigh very heavily on anyone who knows that they're constantly under supervision and surveillance, and that there's always some AI computer vision program that's like scrutinizing their every move.
Yeah, I mean, so that particular instance was something, back when my parents had just arrived in the country from El Salvador and sort of felt like they didn't have much power to say anything. But it's continued through various other jobs, and sometimes it's kind of gone from being more of a spy cam into just, a lot of homes, especially in well-off areas, have just sort of decided that these doorbell cameras and various other cameras are kind of standard operating procedure just to keep yourself safe. But to your point, the feeling of being watched carries this sort of very tangible harm that you can't always put your finger on, but you know what it's like, how you change your behavior, how you feel a little bit like you have to act a certain way because you're being watched. Even if my mother isn't having her like comings and goings tracked on a day-to-day basis, she feels like she is, because the reality is that there's always video footage of when she arrives and when she leaves. So if the boss decides that they want to start doing that, they can start doing that. And so when the way that these infrastructures can sort of change people's behavior, and also the reality is that they can't really tell someone to get rid of them because it's not their device. So I think oftentimes these ideas around user consent and user privacy are very focused on the person that buys the technology and doesn't really account for the reality that a lot of people have no control over it. And similarly, for some of these technologies, they're either placed in people's apartment complexes without any sort of ability to say no, or they're corollary devices. It's not hard to compare a like fitness tracker to like an ankle bracelet. These are sort of tools that just generally can very easily be used for more sort of supervisory purposes.
And the lack of rules, I mean, it's somewhat unsurprising when you think of just how bad the American legal system is at, protecting people from, the way land owners abuse their rights on their property, and the way that people abuse, socioeconomic status. But one of the most surprising aspects of this is just the lack of legal protections, even when the government gets involved. I mean, tell us a bit about sort of the legal guardrails or lack thereof for how this information is obtained by police.
Yeah, so one of the reasons behind the project was trying to understand like what are the guardrails in place. You know, when you read a privacy policy, they kind of generally all have the same language around how they'll turn over user data as required by law or regulation, and in some emergency situations, they might disclose information to law enforcement. It doesn't really tell you much. If you want to sort of step back in terms of like what the Fourth Amendment says, it's kind of unclear because the technologies are sort of thought about in isolation and haven't been sort of tested out in courts yet. So we have to sort of rely on corollary technologies and think about, well, is it like cell site location information in that it captures this like detailed like account of people's movement over time? Maybe in some instances, like with a fitness tracker or a sort of GPS tracker on your car, then yeah, maybe that is more like that. But in the case of perhaps like just footage of sort of a doorbell or something, or if you have a limited license plate reader network in your home or in your neighborhood, that might be a little bit different. So there isn't kind of a clear one-to-one, this definitely requires a warrant or definitely doesn't require a warrant. So when there's more flexibility, you kind of turn to, okay, well, if it's not the Fourth Amendment, maybe there's like a statutory protection, but the protections around sharing information doesn't like the under the Stored Communications Act won't always apply to every technology. And in some ways, the fact that these tools collect data for a number of different purposes, including just to like have data to train their systems to make them more, to have updates on new product lines, that can also sort of just pull them out of the Stored Communications Act, so they have even fewer protections. So in reality, sometimes the only real protection is what they say in their privacy policy. And if they decide that they consider something an emergency and they sort of want to give information to law enforcement, there's very little like as an ordinary person you can do about it. And there's very little you can even know to even know that it happened in the first place.
Yeah, and for the non-lawyers, the Stored Communications Act of 1986 was basically the last time Congress dealt with the issue seriously of how you protect the privacy of electronic communications. And obviously, just from the date of the law, it is woefully out of date. It basically was as soon as the ink was dry on the bill, and so we have a legal framework, a statutory framework that was created at a time when people assumed emails would be deleted after 30 days and assumed that people would only store a tiny amount of information on servers, and had all of these assumptions about technology. And you have a Fourth Amendment that was written obviously before we had electricity, let alone computers, and they don't provide a meaningful framework for a lot of this. And so I think the point you raised about cell site information is key, because that's the most recent Supreme Court decision we have in this area, saying that you do need a warrant to track our locations based off of what the cell towers record about us. And so that's sort of been this sort of foot in the door of modernizing the Fourth Amendment in a meaningful way to deal with electronic communications. But do you think that given the different types of reforms out there, the legislative campaigns, all the litigation, the just public outrage, what do you think is the path forward here in sort of trying to have the law, catch up at least, 35 years and with the state of, modern technology?
That's a hard question. I think that the law is in some ways sort of needs to have an active acknowledgement about how technology works and how a lot of these tools are not sort of just used in isolation. So a picture from someone's doorbell, if it's run through facial recognition, is much more invasive than if it's just an ordinary surveillance device that's not being connected to the internet and being analyzed against every other picture. But also that picture, if it's then connected to a domain awareness system, run against a gang database, run against a number of other police databases, there's so much more of a surveillance infrastructure that won't necessarily be accounted for if we're just looking at the individual technology, what it captures and what it doesn't. And I think that courts may be starting to move in that direction, but it's going to take a lot more sort of advocacy from people to sort of help courts see that. At the same time, there's just a reality to need to address it more head on, and that can be, that might vary from place to place, but it may be the reality that in some jurisdictions there's just new legislation to ban certain technologies, full stop, or in other situations pass rules around if you want to use this technology in this way, you have to have a warrant, and just making that more explicit. So I think that right now, rather than waiting for judicial opinions to catch up, I think there's an opportunity and a real need for communities to actually pass new laws.
And how do you respond to sort of the argument that, well, all this information is being captured anyway, all of it's on social media platform, it's on all of these other platforms. How do you respond to people who just don't think there's a there there?
Yeah, I think that part of it is, again, to sort of remind folks that there is a difference between, your picture being captured in like when you go to the mall or something on a TV camera, and that being run against a face recognition database, or it being stored indefinitely in another police system that says, oh, well, Albert is friends with this person who knows this person who is in criminal organization, so we're going to keep tabs on him now because we think that he might be a part of a criminal conspiracy. The sort of integration of these various tools, I think, would frustrate most people's expectations of privacy. And I think that the idea around public space is traditionally kind of limited by the idea that, well, you can't have cops watching everybody 24/7. So if you have one person monitoring somebody and then maybe they travel with them for a little bit, there are sort of just like human restraints on how long and how extensively you can monitor someone. And I think modern technology really eliminates a lot of those things.
And I just want to invite the audience, for those of you on Zoom, please feel free to submit your questions as we're going through. For those of you on YouTube, I'm not sure if that function will work. We are at the mercy of our technological overlords to some degree, but happy to have that as part of the conversation, because we really want to make this as interactive as possible. But I was hoping you could go through a few more examples of specific cases where this has gone awry and where this sort of technology has been and this sort of information has been misused.
Well, as I'm sure is common with a lot of the work that you do and we do together on surveillance technology, it's kind of not always public how these tools are used, and not all of this information makes its way into court records. So part of the project that we did was try to find instances of this technology being used and described in a court case. It's not, I haven't been able to find clear-cut examples of something that was clearly wrongfully done. So to give you an example, a technology like OnStar, where your car will connect with someone and a service representative, someone accidentally hit that button and they were committing a crime and were on a couple of drugs, and the OnStar representative thought it would be a great idea to patch in the police. And so they called in the police and then had the police sort of record what was going on and sort of overhear what was being said. There was another case where, there have been a couple of cases actually of just basically what people are calling car tapping, which is just activating various speakers that exist within a car to record a conversation. Most of the time when law enforcement does that, they are getting warrants, and not just warrants, but like this kind of more protective warrants that require showing that there are other methods that you could have taken that either didn't work or are likely to fail. So there is some legal process being followed. In other instances, there has been, for example, a person said that she had been raped, and then her Fitbit revealed that she was actually, moving around her home and going outside during the time. So she said that she was asleep in her bedroom. So that was used to not only, not move forward with the rape allegation, she was charged with making false statements to the police. So those are some of the examples. I mean, I'm trying to think of another to sort of give you an idea of public footage and where the courts can sometimes fall in this. Is there was a dispute that was happened between two brothers on a driveway, and I think it turned violent. It wasn't any of the brothers' cameras that caught it. It was a neighbor's camera down the street that caught it. So the court said, well, that person volunteered the camera footage to the police, and it happened on a public driveway, so there's no issue here. So those are a few examples.
Yeah, and I think part of what's chilling here is not just the fact that it's diminishing privacy, but just that, again, to go back to that earlier point, I'm so convinced that we're going to see people wrongfully convicted because of misunderstandings of how the technology works or faulty information. And it's one thing if it's sort of this omniscient tracking network versus our civil rights. It's a really flawed and faulty tracking system that people are making a lot of guesses about versus these values of democracy and civil rights and privacy and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the big things to keep in mind is that we're in this moment where people are starting to push back on police surveillance and trying to either say police can't have access to this technology or need to follow this process. And it's not a coincidence that they're increasing their access to private versions of this, because if you go to a private citizen and they voluntarily give over the information, they can get around having to buy technology themselves or disclose that they use a particular tool. We're already seeing companies like Ring, which sell doorbell cameras, Flock Safety, which sell private license plate reader company-wide networks. These companies are sort of in the business of not only selling consumer goods, but having sort of a corollary network that police can access. They'll say, hey, we'll give you this private network of all of our different license plate readers and all of our different camera footage, and we'll make that easy for you to access and review. So it really kind of is doing a bit of an end run around all these nascent movements to regulate surveillance tools.
And I just want to pause to remind everyone again, please feel free to add your questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. But yeah, I know a lot about Ring, but I hadn't heard about Flock Safety before. The name really stood out to me. It's I somehow gave me a mental image of a bunch of gazelles, just running away. But tell us a bit more about what what they do and what their business model is.
Yeah, Flock Safety is in the business of selling license plate readers to either individuals or to homeowners associations, and they also sell to law enforcement, specifically to city government. But a lot of what it does is it just sort of say they'll reach out to homeowners associations and say, hey, don't you want to be able to know if someone came into your neighborhood and stole your car or did some property damage? You can set up these cameras at various entryways into your neighborhood, and you'll be able to track who comes in and out. And you'll see these testimonials of like Joe Schmo who like loves to keep track of everybody and will say like, oh yeah, I can log in whenever I want and I'll be able to know when someone came home, when someone else wasn't here. And that is the business model, is essentially private security through license plate readers. It's unclear whether that actually does much of anything in terms of people's safety. It certainly makes it the case, to that guy's point, that he might have a child who is doing something that he shouldn't be doing, or someone gets caught in an affair or something. There are so many other things that can get captured by this information, but the basic business model of a company like Flock Safety is selling the idea that if you know which cars come in and out, you'll be able to stop crime.
Yeah, that's just horrifying to me. I mean, so it's bad enough when you see a governmental database that's working this way, but to have an open source platform for anyone who wants to set up a little, car tracking device on their front porch, that to me really transforms the broader impact of these cameras. I think, at least from my perspective, and something you've brought out a lot tonight, is just the fact that you can have the same hardware and vastly different impacts in what is, in the privacy cost of those technologies, depending on the software you're running on the back end, the amount of data that's being captured, and whether biometrics are being used or automated license plate readers or other software.
Yeah, and another thing to keep in mind with that, which is that a lot of these companies are offering the entire suite of technologies, right? So Google has indoor cameras, outdoor cameras, a smart speaker that can record conversations. It also has, a CarPlay equivalent to what Apple has. It has a partnership with the private security company Brink, so it'll dispatch people to your home if you feel unsafe. They have, an alarm system. They have a whole suite of different technologies that are all integrated and can be sort of, it basically can create your own little personal domain awareness system.
And the domain awareness system, for those of you who have not had the pleasure of going down this particular Orwellian rabbit hole, is the public-private partnership that came from the lovely surveillance vendors over at Microsoft and our friends at the NYPD when they decided to create this multi-headed hydra of surveillance around New York City that integrates, over 20,000 cameras, thermal imaging, radiological sensors, environmental sensors, MTA trip data. I'm sure they're trying to get bodega coffee orders and your a Netflix history in there somehow, but it's basically this gigantic pool of information that's been cobbled together by the NYPD, and it's completely unclear if it's actually helpful in any of these public safety missions, but it's quite clear that it's very, very, very expensive.
Yeah, and I think it's another one of those things that kind of was a preview of what was to come with these private surveillance systems, in that there is an undisclosed number of private bodegas, corporations that give access to their footage that pipes directly into the domain awareness system. We don't know which cameras those are, where they're located, who else has access to them.
And this is similar to what we've seen with Project Greenlight in Detroit, which had a very high profile and controversial partnership where they were telling stores not just, hey, we want to partner with you to see your footage in real time, but we'll give you priority 911 response if you do this. And so you're effectively bribing people with preferential law enforcement treatment if they agree to host your surveillance cameras. And it's something where there's been a lot of pushback by activists there, especially when it was being combined with expanded facial recognition software. And we've seen that same model being rolled out in a number of other cities. I know I think it's a Project Blue Light or something along those lines down in Texas that's trying to pilot the same model. So do we have a sense of how often tech companies are handing over this data? Like, how much transparency is there?
Yeah, so some technology companies like Amazon and Google and Apple do publish transparency reports that give you a sense of how much governments are asking for user data, but it's inconsistent. Google hasn't published one at all for all of 2020, as far as I've been able to find. And what a lot of these disclosures do is they pool together all of the requests. So we don't understand how often they're asking for camera footage versus Gmail footage versus a smart speaker recording versus anything else. It's all kind of clumped together into one. So it's really hard to really understand what kinds of data and how often. That being said, it's pretty consistent across the various products. There's just been exponential increase over time. It's somewhere 200% increase in how often law enforcement is asking for this data. All that being said, a lot of common popular different technology companies don't publish this information at all. So most car companies aren't telling you how often they're disclosing information to law enforcement. Some of the competitors in the space, like Amazon and Google, don't publish transparency reports. So it really is kind of unclear how pervasive it is.
And we have to also keep in mind that this is happening globally. One thing that really stuck out for me about the Google Transparency Report, the most recent one we have on record from 2019, I mean, they disclose that, they've had requests from law enforcement agencies in over 120 countries. This is, something that disproportionately is happening in the US, and is certainly happening through parallel and sometimes much more invasive surveillance mechanisms in China. But it's definitely something that is not unique to us, and something where we see these same, tech vendors really enabling this level of surveillance in incredibly undemocratic regimes, to the extent we even want to claim that the US continues to be a democratic regime. That's a whole different event. But do you think that the global use of these technologies brings an additional human rights impact? Or do you think it's the same human rights debate that we're seeing here in the US with the over policing of communities of color, low income communities, and immigrant communities?
It's certainly a concern that it's happening everywhere, but the reason that it's concerning is very, to your point, the same. It's the way in which surveillance technology is used to control, surveil, and sort of keep tabs on marginalized groups. That will be women, people of color, immigrants, the usual people that are the targets of government marginalization. That is an issue whether it happens here or another regime. Certainly in certain other parts of the world that might be more regularly abused and can have much more like lasting consequences, but it is a similar threat to people's freedoms and rights here. And there's reason to be concerned that it's being done by private companies that have basically very little oversight.
And given that, where do you come out on the debate about whether to regulate or abolish these technologies? Do you think it depends on the technology, it depends on the agency, or do you think that there's some clear guidelines about what the next step should be?
Me as a person,
I mean, you as the person who's been doing amazing research on this issue. I mean, if not you, who?
yeah, I think that certain technologies are pretty incompatible with democratic freedom. I think that having total surveillance makes it impossible to organize, to feel like you can move about and challenge the existing status quo, and it kind of arrests where we are as a society to where we are in 2021. And I think that given the year that we just had and the first month that we're experiencing, I don't think anyone would think that we're exactly where we need to be and that we can stop worrying about progress. And so there certainly needs to be a lot more efforts to push back against the expansion of surveillance technologies in a way that will really limit our ability to progress as a society.
And on that note, I think we'll go to the first audience question, but really want to encourage folks to submit the questions they have using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. I believe that you can also submit your questions using the chat function on YouTube. So the first one comes from Zach, who asks, what are the ways in which you're seeing smart cities / devices exasperating the over-policing of communities of color, immigrant communities, etc.?
We haven't looked too much into smart cities yet. I think that the most we sort of started to look into is trying to understand the infrastructure as it was being built in relation to smart cars. And it seems like a lot of cars are sort of being prepped for an idea of where there will be smart cities. So I can't speak to the current situation. I think that, like we're talking about now, it's sort of a situation where it can be pitched as one thing, whether it's trying to do environmental controls to keep pollution down or to try to keep traffic flows going in a particular way. But it's probably pretty predictable to think that those justifications will not stop police access and will not also have sort of downstream consequences in terms of redirecting that environmental harm to communities of color and other places that usually are sort of where we push all the things that we don't want to deal with.
And I think the car example keeps bringing me back to well, the fact that we always in the US treat cars as this space that's more subject to government supervision and government regulation and government search. And we've created it as this sort of starting point for systems of mass surveillance that then we try to replicate into the home. And I was wondering if you've looked at any of the emerging projects around congestion pricing here in New York or elsewhere, because I'm imagining that as we make the transition to a congestion pricing model, something that as a New Yorker I desperately want to make the city more walkable, isn't there a profound risk that we're going to further expand the technologies that are used to perpetually track vehicles and in ways that allow for even greater police intervention and abuse of policing?
So I think you're the expert on congestion pricing, if I'm not mistaken. You've written about it, but I think that what I do know is that, there was some reporting done on the Intercept that was talking about vendors that sell license plate readers and were looking to do some congestion pricing bidding, and they were sort of saying, hey, we can map the routes that people take, and we can create profiles of cars and tell you how many people are in them, all this different information, which of course would be very useful to ICE and other organizations that want to keep track of how, where are people going to work, how many people are in a car, what are the common routes that they take. All this information, of course, whenever you start to collect it, you have to know that it's going to be of interest to law enforcement, and they're never going to ask for it.
And I wanted to turn to a question from YouTube. Caitlin Thompson is a reporter from Coda Story and wanted to ask how you regulate law enforcement use of private surveillance technology. We've seen some cities like Portland try, but what are the challenges there?
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges is just what we've been talking a lot about, which is people can voluntarily disclose information to law enforcement, and a lot of that kind of stems out of an idea around the third party doctrine, which sort of says, hey, if you share information with somebody, then they might turn it over to somebody else, and so you kind of have to bear the risk of that happening. The Portland example of doing a flat ban on particular things, like I haven't seen too much of that happening in other jurisdictions, but there certainly will be challenges in terms of whether that is constitutional and whether you're allowed to control to that extent. But I would have to look into the specifics to be able to tell you more.
Yeah, and I think with Portland, it really is an interesting tension. The idea that you would have a parallel private sector facial recognition ban as sort of the most extreme option in some ways of how you approach that question. I know that there have been some examples of cities that have facial recognition bans where they get facial recognition searches delivered to them by like companies that for example, you can imagine 7-Eleven or Dwayne Reed or one of these places that has used customer-facing facial recognition, using that on their own database and then providing that to police. And that would fall outside the scope of facial recognition bans because it's a private use, but still you see people being arrested at the end of the day. And so it seems like a really hard problem.
I mean, one of the interesting things that's happening as a corollary would be to think about the various lawsuits that are being brought in Illinois against companies like Clearview. And so it's not necessarily a piece of legislation over private companies as much as it is there is protection over your ability to consent or not consent to your face being used in a technology. And so using class actions to basically try and stop that practice is a different way that you could go about trying to regulate private companies that are engaging in surveillance. But that's just how successful those are over time is still yet to be seen.
Yeah, that Illinois law, BIPA, the Biometric Information Privacy Act, is one of my favorite laws in the country. Underappreciated. It is essentially the only meaningful biometric privacy law in the United States. One thing I want to highlight is here in New York, we have a copy of that law, which is under review by our state legislature, and I'm quite optimistic it will pass. But it's really crucial because right now we see a lot of these companies lobbying like mad out in Illinois to water down the protections they have there. And because it's the only law of its kind in the country, if we lose that one statute and we don't pass something similar in other states, we're going to lose this sort of level of biometric protection for the entire country, which is kind of a ridiculous state to be in, where one state is our only like defense against biometric tracking. Are there any other sort of models that you've seen or contemplated that you think would be effective in addressing some of the harms we've seen from this sort of public-private surveillance partnership?
You know, one of the things that we're currently trying to get a better handle on is sort of the public-private partnerships and trying to understand how much where that money comes from. And, you know, I know that you do a lot of work as well, trying to understand groups like the Police Foundation here and what they're doing to fund some of the surveillance tools that are being used by NYPD. In terms of private organizations that sell this technology to individuals, it's just a trickier question because, you know, it is sort of not necessarily contemplated as a like surveillance tool for the government. It's sort of thought as a private sort of security system that you have for yourself, and you're trying to keep an eye on your property. It's just sort of trying. So in a lot of ways, I think that one of the logical pressure points is just individual advocacy. A lot of these efforts around like breaking up with ICE or breaking up with Amazon over their partnerships with ICE and that sort of thing, like bringing exposure to how much these private companies are selling and sort of sharing their information with law enforcement can actually be one of the sort of strongest ways to sort of push back.
Yeah, and I definitely want to give a shout out to Media Justice and the Athena Coalition for the work they've been doing about with their campaigns targeting consumers, and the way they are using Amazon products. Maisha Hayes has done a lot of work specifically there, and we know they've been doing a lot to build that up. I know this is a bit of a shift in topic, but one of the things I keep hearing about is, these companies are so huge, it's so hard to actually give them up, when, living a life without any of the tech monopolies is going to cost you a lot, and it's going to, exclude you from a lot of the things that, define modern life. So, do you think that to some degree antitrust enforcement and breaking these companies up is going to play an important role, or do you think that's just going to give us a bunch of smaller surveillance vendors doing the exact same thing?
Well, I think both things can be true. It can be true that we have created monopolies that are anti-competitive and harming communities, and it can also be true that we have to be wary of what might come afterwards. And even with those large corporations, we still have plenty of small surveillance vendors like a Flock Safety who are already doing sort of similarly harmful things. Um, you know, it's one of those things where, in the same way that we talk about surveillance tools in isolation, we oftentimes talk about reforms in isolation. So if we actually talk about meaningful antitrust enforcement, and we talk about passing federal privacy legislation, and we talk about banning certain technologies, and we talk about users taking or people taking action and sort of doing boycotts and actually shifting public or company practices through their own power, we can actually build a much better world than the one we live in. But it sometimes can be hard enough to think about how to get one achieved, but in some ways we need to do it all.
Yeah, and it really does seem that these are all interdependent campaigns, and as much as I love the legal work, it's clear that we lawyers are not going to be the ones who solve this at the end of the day. It's going to be community driven. It's going to be coalition based, and it's going to be much broader. So I know we don't have a ton of time left, and again, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button in Zoom or the chat function in YouTube. But I just wanted to, ask, are there any companies that you think have really flown under the radar, and that you're surprised they're not household names for the sort of level of impact they're having?
Well, the way that I would say, actually, I think there's a lot of focus on Amazon. And this is not a small player, but Google is just as important and does a lot of the same work, and has, if anything, Amazon Ring doesn't have facial recognition on their cameras, Google does. There are lots of different things that Google's doing, and I think that they've been able to sort of, in this space and a lot of other instances, I think, keep their heads down and let another company kind of take the brunt of media attention. So, it's not a small player, but I think people should take a look at Google and how much they're doing a lot of the same stuff that people think is creepy about. Like, I think people just have used the word Alexa and Ring, and those words mean a lot to them, but just because Google has more friendly branding like hello and things like that doesn't make it any less invasive. But I'm trying to think of if there's another company that does particularly poorly. I think that honestly, if you just, any tool that you have, if they don't even have, some of these companies don't even have like privacy policies that have been updated in like 10 years, or don't publish any transparency reports. Like, some of these sort of basic steps are certainly nowhere near enough, but they're not really doing a whole lot. And I think there's a concern that if a law enforcement request comes in, yeah, it's nice to know that Amazon and Google have occasionally like fought subpoenas and fought warrants and have sort of tried to stand up for their users. But what are the odds that a smaller company is going to want to invest the time to do that? They might just think it's easier to give the information to police and move on.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, I'm never sure how much good privacy policies do, but when you see when you see a company that isn't even bothering to take that one step, it's sort of, it's definitely a red flag that they're not really focusing on this as an issue.
Or they just like copy and paste it from a different company.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of plagiarism out there with privacy documents is astounding. But it is really stunning when you bring up Google, just how much they've been able to avoid the sort of the pushback that rightfully has been focused on Amazon. And their AWS hosts Palantir and lots of awful companies, but Google Cloud does the same. And they're both fighting for defense contracts to host the cloud for our domestic law enforcement and military operations and all of that. And it just seems like astounding that they somehow are able to keep a friendly image for much of the PR. So if there was one step that people could take in their daily lives to reduce the amount of data they're leaking, that if there's a step or two that they can take to protect their privacy from this sort of surveillance, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, acknowledging that this is an incomplete fix, there are very basic things that you can do, like turning off location services or something, clearing your history in certain devices like a speaker or something. I don't like the setup that companies like Google have, where they say, hey, if you have a guest that's coming over, you should let them know that there's a privacy policy that's governing the recording of certain words, or you can, they've released these new versions of like guest mode where they will turn off some functionality when you have someone there. Like, these are all kind of intermediary steps. Like, frankly, think about whether you need all these technologies and whether it's actually making you any safer, and whether you're actually maybe contributing more to it broaden the surveillance by having a connected doorbell. If you're going to keep a smart speaker, you want to like chop some vegetables and ask how to translate certain measurements, like consider turning that stuff off and putting it away when you have someone coming over. If nothing else, that person can, for now, ask that smart device a question about your calendar or your email or your text messages and have them read out to you. And I'm sure that wouldn't be good.
Yeah, I feel like you can get a cookbook to tell you a lot of those recipe issues a lot more easily. I mean, my personal suggestion is, anytime someone gives you a smart device, is look up the manual so you can figure out how to cut out the microphone. But I realize that is a particularly aggressive stance to take. So we have a question, it may be our last, on looking at sort of the apps that we all use to communicate, and how so much of the police surveillance is targeting that. And what do you think are like the smart apps to have for confidential communication?
Yeah, I mean, I think that'll depend on your what your life is like and what you need. I think sometimes there's a lot of pressure to like download Signal or do a bunch of extra things to keep your phone safe. In a lot of ways, if you've got an iPhone, your iMessage is encrypted unless you're talking to an Android user. So like there's not necessarily a need to go overboard on some of these things. But I think it's probably better to just open up your phone, look at the various apps that you may have downloaded and ask whether you need them, and maybe review what kind of permissions they have and whether they really need to be accessing your entire contact list, whether they need to sort of be able to record your microphone, based on and when you're not using it. But to answer more broadly, I think that we are potentially moving in a direction where there might be some concerted efforts to fight encryption and trying to make a case that we need to have, the usual back doors into these technologies. And I think it's important that we resist those efforts and make it clear that encryption and privacy is a really important mechanism for people to be able to organize politically, to be able to sort of, organize and fight for their rights. And so it needs to be something that we protect, even if we're going through a situation right now where the insurrection may be making people feel like there's a good exception for this one case, as if that's going to be the only time that it's used, and that if we don't have a long history of understanding that more often than not it's going to be used to target communities of color.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important note to end on, especially in the aftermath of the recent Capitol attack and the insurrection. Just there right now is a call from so many people to expand surveillance to capture the people behind that. But first off, we don't really need to do that because they live streamed the crimes and are giving their names away and all of these other. It's a very easy case to solve, but just exactly the point you made, that if we normalize these tools and expand these tools to target communities of color, if we expand them to target, even right-wing extremists, they'll end up being used to target communities of color. That's just the sad part.
And I think that certainly some of the lessons that we have been pushing back on in terms of social media monitoring and what it means to try to like deduce people's feelings and likely actions based on what they do on the internet, like certainly in some instances we have seen people that have committed violence based on what they were saying, but we also need to be aware that we know that there's lots of time where police officers have made assumptions about people's participation in crime simply because they said something they were going to do something, and in reality they were just trying to diffuse violence. And so we should be cautious against digging too much into the idea that you can sort of predict everything that's going to happen in the real world because someone said something on the internet.
Well, on that note, we're going to have to bring tonight's conversation to a close, but thank you all for tuning in. Angel, thank you so much for joining us. And, next month we'll be joined by Rebecca Wexler, and we'll be talking about some of the issues around trade secrets and the ways that it's used to hide the tools that are tracking us all. But thank you again for joining us tonight, Angel, and for all the work you've been doing to fight these just terrible technologies.